Dawn of the Golden Age, the sea has always been both a cradle of fortune and a graveyard of the forgotten. In the early 1700s, when the smoke of European wars still hung heavy across the Atlantic, the world's oceans transformed into a stage where lawlessness and ambition collided. Empires had fought themselves into exhaustion. The War of the Spanish Succession had drained coffers, scattered armies, and left thousands of hardened sailors without masters or pay. They were men who had risked their lives for crowns and kings, only to be discarded like driftwood. On every dockside, from Bristol to Havana, from Port Royal to the hidden coves of Madagascar, unemployed sailors shuffled their feet, stared at empty purses, and listened to the whispers of opportunity that came with the black flag. But piracy was not born in a single night. It grew like a shadow. First, in the guise of privateers, legal pirates, licensed by monarchs to plunder their enemies. They carried letters of marque, bits of parchment that turned robbery into patriotism. These men had become heroes of their nations during the wars, raiding Spanish treasure fleets, seizing galleons fat with silver, and returning home as legends. Yet when the wars ended, so too did their contracts. To many of these men, the line between sanctioned plunder and outlaw piracy was paper-thin, and when hunger gnawed and the sea called, they crossed it without hesitation. It was an age when the Caribbean shimmered like a jewel of temptation. Spain's colonies in the Americas produced unimaginable wealth, mountains of silver from Potosi, rivers of gold from New Granada, and endless cargoes of sugar, tobacco, indigo, and rum. Each ship that crossed the Atlantic was a floating treasure chest, its sails heavy with fortune, its decks creaking with greed. For pirates, these ships were not merely targets. They were salvation, revenge, and the promise of freedom. And so the Golden Age of Piracy began, not golden in riches for all, but golden in daring, in rebellion, and in the creation of legends that would echo for centuries. Life at sea was brutal, yet strangely liberating. On a pirate ship, men, who had once been flogged by captains, starved by greedy merchants, or ignored by aristocrats, could now vote, share in spoils, and find equality unknown on land. A black man freed from bondage, a runaway European servant, a native islander, and a poor fisherman could all stand shoulder to shoulder under the same banner. The sea was their equalizer. Their ships became floating republics, bound not by royal decrees but by codes of conduct written in salt and blood. Each man had a voice. Each man had a share. If a captain grew too cruel or cowardly, he could be voted out. To a world that preached hierarchy and oppression, the pirate way was radical. Dangerous, yes, but intoxicating. The harbors of Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal began to swell with this strange brotherhood. Sailors sang of riches yet to be claimed, women whispered tales of lovers lost to the deep, and taverns shook with laughter and brawls until dawn. Every man who lifted a mug of rum knew he might not live another year, but for a few nights, with music roaring and gold glinting in the candlelight, he felt immortal. And yet outside those havens, the empires stirred. Kings and governors called, them criminals, beasts to be hunted and hanged. The gallows at Execution Dock in London stood as grim reminders that the world's patience would not last forever. But in those first years, before the noose tightened, before the great hunts began, the seas belonged to the free, the desperate, and the bold. From these restless beginnings rose names that would terrify nations. Edward Teach, called Blackbeard, who strode across decks wreathed in smoke and flame. Charles Vane, whose fury could not be contained by prison or rope. Bartholomew Roberts, who captured more ships than any man before him. And Anne Bonny, who shattered every expectation of what a woman could be in a man's world. Their stories would come later, carved into the waves like scars. But in this first dawn, they were still unknown, still lost among the thousands of nameless sailors who dared to defy the empires. They were seeds drifting on the wind of history, waiting for the storm that would make them infamous. Thus, the Golden Age began, not with triumph, but with desperation, not with crowns and titles, but with hunger, betrayal, and the cruel laughter of fate. The oceans opened themselves as both sanctuary and grave, and the men who stepped aboard those weathered ships carried no illusions. They were hunted men, rebels without nations, ghosts in the making. Yet in their rebellion, they created something the world could never forget: the untold history of freedom on the high seas, written in salt water, gunpowder, and blood. The pirate. Havens. When the dawn of piracy first broke, it was not on the open waves alone, but in the hidden harbors, the crooked inlets, and the wild frontier towns where law wore a thin disguise. If the high seas were the stage, then the pirate havens were the backstage, where men and women forged identities, struck bargains, and drank to both their victories and their impending dooms. The most infamous of these havens was Nassau on New Providence Island in the Bahamas. To the crowns of Europe, Nassau was a lawless cesspool, a blot of anarchy in the otherwise ordered map of empire. But to the pirates, it was home, a republic of rogues, and a sanctuary from gallows and governors. The harbor itself, ringed with turquoise waters and guarded by shallow reefs, was perfect for swift pirate sloops, but deadly for the lumbering warships of empire. It was a natural fortress, one gifted by the sea. Here, ships limped in after battles, sails torn and hulls leaking, and here they were patched, rearmed, and made ready to strike again. The streets of Nassau were a study in chaos. Sailors of every color and creed jostled together: English runaways, African freedmen, Dutch deserters, French turncoats, and native islanders. Women sold fruit and rum from wooden stalls. Children darted between taverns. Drunken men sang shanties, with voices hoarse from salt air. At night, the sound of fiddles and laughter rose from brothels and taverns until the whole town seemed to shake with it. This was no genteel settlement. It was rough, raw, and defiant, yet alive with the fierce pulse of freedom. In Nassau, titles and ancestry meant nothing. A man might be a prince of thieves one night and wake as a beggar the next. The only currency that held weight was courage, wit, and luck. Pirate captains walked the muddy streets without crowns or uniforms, yet they commanded loyalty that kings could only dream of. Men like Benjamin Hornigold set the tone. Once privateers, they now embraced outlawry but carried with them a code of discipline. Others, more brutal, ruled by fear and spectacle, their names whispered in both awe and terror. But Nassau was not alone. Across the Caribbean, other havens pulsed with the same restless energy. Tortuga, the French stronghold off Hispaniola, had been a pirate nest for decades. It was a place where buccaneers roasted stolen cattle over open fires, where smoke and laughter drifted into the night sky, and where deals were struck over mugs of fiery rum. Tortuga's women were as famed as its men, fierce, independent, and unafraid to wield knife or pistol when tempers ran high. Farther south, Port Royal in Jamaica stood as another magnet for those who lived outside the law. Once called the wickedest city on earth, Port Royal was a carnival of sin and survival. Its taverns spilled rum by the barrel, its brothels worked day and night, and its merchants turned a blind eye as stolen Spanish silver passed across their counters. Earthquakes and hurricanes would later punish the city, as if heaven itself had tired of its excess. But in the early years it glittered like a jewel of vice. These havens were more than dens of debauchery. They were laboratories of a strange, new order. Within their walls, the seeds of the pirate code took root. Captains and crews drafted their articles, agreements on how loot would be divided, how injuries compensated, and how disputes settled. In an age when most sailors were little more than slaves to their masters, pirates had invented a rough democracy. Each man's voice counted, each man's share was respected. In these muddy streets and smoky taverns, a new idea was born. That freedom could exist outside the crowns and courts of Europe. Not all who came to these havens were outlaws at first. Many were desperate men seeking shelter, merchants hungry for quick profit, or enslaved people fleeing the cruel plantations. To them, the sight of the black flag was not always terror, but sometimes hope. Pirates often gave refuge to those the world had cast aside. They shared food with the starving, recruited the unwanted, and in some cases, even freed entire crews of slaves from captured ships. Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal were not just havens for pirates, they were havens for the rejected, the forgotten, and the defiant. Of course, this freedom came at a cost. Life in the havens was as dangerous as it was intoxicating. Duels broke out over dice games, arguments ended in blood, and sickness lurked in every corner. Diseases carried by ships swept through taverns like fire in dry grass. Many a pirate, who survived storms and battles, found himself felled by fever in the arms of a drunken companion. The graveyards of these towns filled quickly, their headstones tilting in the salty wind. Yet for every man buried, another two arrived, drawn by the promise of fortune and freedom. The empires could not ignore these strongholds forever. Governors fumed as reports reached their courts. Spanish galleons looted, English merchant fleets scattered. French colonies threatened. To them, Nassau and her sisters were cancers that had to be cut out. But the distance was great, their wars at home drained their resources, and the pirate havens flourished in the cracks of neglect. For a brief, wild time, they became the beating heart of the Golden Age. It was in these places that friendships were forged, betrayals plotted, and legends born. Men and women who would soon become infamous strode these streets in anonymity, Blackbeard laughing in a tavern corner, Anne Bonny slipping a dagger into her boot, Calico Jack bargaining for powder and shot, Bartholomew Roberts, still an unknown mate, watching and learning. The havens were the cauldron, and out of their heat and smoke would rise the stories that haunted empires. In the stillness before dawn, when the drunken songs had faded and only the waves whispered against the docks, one could almost sense the fragile balance of it all. The sun would rise on a lawless town, a defiant community clinging to its freedom, yet already marked for destruction. For in every shadow spies lurked. In every harbor, whispers of betrayal stirred. The havens had given pirates their sanctuary, but they had also painted targets upon their backs. The noose was tightening, even if the revelers could not yet hear its creak. And so, in Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal, the Golden Age of Piracy found its soul. Wild, untamed, rebellious, and doomed. These havens were not merely places on a map, they were symbols of what men could create when pushed beyond the boundaries of law and empire. They were fleeting flames in the storm of history, yet their glow still lingers, lighting the legends of the high seas. Legends rise from the waves, history remembers faces, not crowds. The nameless thousands who took to the sea in hunger and desperation left behind no record, but among them rose figures so fierce, so extraordinary, that their shadows stretch across centuries. These were not kings crowned by birth, but monarchs of terror, crowned by fear and rumor. It was in the taverns of Nassau, the brothels of Port Royal, and the blood-soaked decks of captured galleons that their legends were born. Blackbeard, the Phantom of Terror. His true name was Edward Teach, though some records call him Thatch, and he was no nobleman, no polished officer. He was a common sailor hardened by years of war and hunger. Yet when he stepped into the role of pirate captain, he transformed into something greater, something monstrous. Blackbeard was not merely a man. He was theater. He knew the power of image. Before a battle, he would weave slow-burning fuses into his wild black beard and light them so that smoke curled around his face and sparks danced in his hair. His towering frame, framed by fire and smoke, seemed not human but infernal, a devil conjured from the depths. Sailors swore his eyes glowed like embers, that his laughter could freeze blood, that his very presence made the bravest men tremble, and yet he rarely had to fight. His reputation alone was weapon enough. Merchant captains, seeing the black flag rise and the monstrous figure of Blackbeard approaching, often surrendered without a single shot fired. He was not the cruelest pirate, nor the most ruthless, but he understood that terror was more profitable than bloodshed. Fear was his sharpest blade. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the women who defied the sea in an age when women were silenced. Hidden and chained by society, Anne Bonny refused to bow. Born in Ireland, carried to the New World, she married young, only to find herself bound to a man who lacked her fire. Restless, sharp-tongued, and fearless, she abandoned him for the life of a pirate. At sea, she dressed as a man, fought as fiercely as any sailor, and became notorious for her fury in battle. At her side was Mary Read, another woman who slipped the bonds of expectation. Disguised as a boy since childhood, Mary grew up on battlefields, serving in armies where no woman could stand openly. When her disguise was finally revealed, she did not retreat, but doubled her defiance. Together, Anne and Mary became symbols of a rebellion far greater than piracy, a rebellion against a world that told them who they could or could not be. They sailed with Calico Jack, whose flamboyant style and boldness earned him fame. But in truth, it was the ferocity of the two women that burned brightest. When others hesitated, they charged. When men fled, they stood their ground. Their names became whispers in every tavern, proof that the sea belonged to all who dared. Bartholomew Roberts, the gentleman pirate. If Blackbeard was terror and Anne Bonny was defiance, then Bartholomew Roberts was elegance and ambition. Born a humble Welshman, Roberts rose not through brute force, but through cunning, charisma, and sheer audacity. He dressed not in rags, but in fine silks, carried himself like a courtly gentleman, and drank tea as calmly as if he were in a London parlor. Yet beneath his polished exterior burned a relentless ambition. Roberts captured more ships than any pirate in history, over 400 in just a few short years. His black flag bore a chilling image, a skeleton clutching an hourglass, reminding all that time was short and death certain. He imposed discipline upon his men, enforcing codes that forbade gambling, demanded fairness, and punished cowardice. Under his command, piracy became less a rabble and more an empire. Charles Vane, the fury unleashed. Where Roberts ruled with order, Charles Vane ruled with rage. A man of volcanic temper, Vane was unpredictable, merciless, and feared even among his own. He relished battle, drove his men to the edge, and refused surrender even when defeat was certain. His defiance against authority was absolute, and for a time he seemed unbreakable. But his fire consumed him. Betrayed by his own crew, cast adrift, and finally captured, Vane's story ended on the gallows. Yet his legend of raw fury endured. Birth of legends. What made these men and women legends was not merely their deeds, but the stories told about them. Sailors, merchants, and governors spread tales of their exploits, and each retelling grew grander. A single skirmish became a massacre. A daring escape became divine intervention. Pirates understood this and fed it, exaggerating their own myths, playing roles on the stage of the sea. To the common people, starving under empire, these legends were folk heroes. They were rebels who mocked the kings and took riches from the powerful. To the merchants and governors, they were nightmares that stalked trade routes. And to the sailors who dreamed of freedom, they were proof that the sea could make a man or a woman immortal. In the crowded taverns of Nassau, the voices rose. Blackbeard's beard caught fire, and he didn't even flinch. Anne Bonny gutted a man twice her size. Robert sipped tea as his cannons fired. Truth and myth tangled like rigging in a storm, and from that tangle, legends were born. By the time the world's empires truly turned their eyes upon them, these figures were no longer just criminals. They were symbols, fearsome, inspiring, and larger than life. And once a symbol is born, it cannot be easily killed. Even when the hangman's rope tightened, even when musket balls tore through flesh, the stories lived on. The Golden Age of Piracy now had its champions, its devils, its saints, and its martyrs. And their rise marked the height of the age, the moment when the seas themselves seemed to bow to the black flag. Legends rise from the waves. The sea has no patience for the ordinary. It crushes the weak, swallows the forgotten, and only remembers those who leave scars upon its surface. In the early years of the Golden Age of Piracy, hundreds of nameless men and women drifted into obscurity, their bones left to rot in shallow graves or sink beneath coral reefs. But out of that chaos, a handful of figures emerged whose shadows grew taller than their bodies, whose names carried more weight than cannon fire, and whose reputations turned mere mortals into myths. They did not rise all at once, nor were they, molded from the same fire. Each carried a story of betrayal, of hunger, of rage, of pride, that shaped them into icons of the high seas. If the Golden Age had a soul, it was etched into these faces. Smoke-crowned devils, fearless women with daggers in hand, gentlemen of death, and captains who would sooner burn than bow. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, the phantom of terror before. He was Blackbeard. He was Edward Teach of Bristol, a man of salt and toil, no different from thousands of others who had sweated under the lash aboard naval ships. He was broad-shouldered, cunning, and quiet. Not the monstrous phantom that history remembers. But Teach was no fool. He knew survival on the sea depended not just on strength, but on fear. The moment he took command of his own vessel, he reinvented himself. He grew his beard into a tangled black storm that fell across his chest. He tied ribbons in it, as though mocking the fashion of aristocrats, but in battle he twisted hemp cords into it, soaking them in saltpeter and slow match. When lit, they hissed and smoked, cloaking his face in a halo of fire and brimstone. His eyes, already piercing, shone through the smoke like coals. To his enemies, he was no longer a man. He was an apparition, a devil risen from the deep. It is said that when Blackbeard blocked Charleston Harbor with his fleet, demanding medicine as ransom, the entire city trembled. He did not storm the town nor slaughter innocents. He simply held the ships hostage, his monstrous figure pacing the deck while smoke coiled around him. The message was clear: fear me, and I need not strike. Blackbeard was a master of theater. He rarely killed more than necessary, for dead men told no tales, but frightened men told 1,000. Each sailor who fled before his guns carried his legend farther, until his name alone emptied holds faster than cannon fire could. He was not the cruelest pirate, but he was the most unforgettable. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the women, who refused silence. The Caribbean was a man's world, or so the world believed. Yet 2 women tore that belief apart with steel and fury. Anne Bonny was born into scandal. Her father, a wealthy Irish lawyer, dressed her as a boy in childhood to conceal her illegitimacy. When the disguise was no longer needed, Anne shed it, but not the fire it had planted in her. She grew into a woman with red hair, a sharp tongue, and fists quick to strike. By the time she arrived in the New World, she had little patience for propriety. She married a penniless sailor, but when his weakness disgusted her, she abandoned him for the pirate Calico Jack Rackham. Anne wanted not a husband's protection, but the raw freedom of the sea. Mary Read's life was no less unusual. Raised As a boy, so her mother could fraudulently claim an inheritance, Mary lived her youth in disguise. She fought as a soldier in European wars, dueling, marching, and bleeding beside men who never suspected her secret. When she was finally unmasked, instead of retreating to womanly roles, she embraced her defiance. She disguised herself again when she turned pirate, for she had already tasted the life denied to her gender, and she would not surrender it. Together, Anne and Mary became storms in human form. In tavern brawls, they struck harder than men. In naval battles, they were said to fight with eyes blazing, pistols cracking, and cutlasses flashing until their enemies reeled in disbelief. When others hesitated, they led the charge. When their male companions faltered, they stood unyielding. Their existence alone was rebellion, a dagger thrust at a society that thought them incapable. One night in Nassau, a drunken sailor jeered at Anne for playing cards like a man. She flipped the table, pressed her knife to his throat, and spat, "Better to lose to me than die by me." The tavern roared with laughter, but no one mocked her again. Bartholomew Roberts, the gentleman of death. If Blackbeard was terror, and Anne Bonny defiance, Bartholomew Roberts was order carved into chaos. He dressed in rich silks, his hat adorned with feathers, his manner calm and courtly even in battle. To look upon him was to see not a ragged outlaw, but a commander who belonged in a palace. Yet Roberts was no mere pretender. He rose from humble beginnings, a Welsh sailor pressed into piracy almost by accident. But once he accepted the life, he surpassed all who came before him. In just 3 years, he captured over 400 ships, more than any pirate in history. He patrolled the Atlantic like a monarch, seizing vessels from Brazil to West Africa to the Caribbean, his black flag raised high. Roberts enforced strict codes upon his men. Gambling was forbidden. Drunkenness was punished. Each man had his share of loot, but cowardice was death. He ran his ship as though it were a navy of its own, disciplined and precise, yet still governed by the democratic articles of piracy. His men respected him, and his enemies feared him, for his mixture of elegance and ruthlessness gave him an aura unlike any other. His banner struck terror, a skeleton holding an hourglass, dancing beside death itself. The message was clear. Time runs out for all, and Roberts would be the one to claim it. Charles Vane. The Fury Unleashed. Charles Vane was the sea's embodiment of rage. Where Roberts used order, Vane used chaos. His cruelty was legendary, his temper volcanic. Sailors under him never knew whether they would share in plunder or bleed under his lash. He burned ships for pleasure, defied governors with curses, and spat in the face of mercy. In Nassau, Vane stood apart from the other captains. He refused the king's pardon when others bent to it, declaring he would rather die free than live chained. His defiance earned him respect among outlaws, but also enemies among his own men. When his fury became unbearable, his crew abandoned him, casting him adrift on the very sea he loved. Captured at last, he went to the gallows snarling, never begging, never yielding. His death was brutal, but his legend endured, whispered in taverns as the tale of a man who refused every chain, even at the cost of his life. The making of myth. What made these figures legends was not just what they did, but how their stories were told. Fear exaggerates, awe distorts. A single victory became 10. A daring escape grew into a miracle. Sailors who had glimpsed Blackbeard's smoking beard swore they had seen the devil himself. Soldiers who fought Anne Bonny or Mary Read insisted the women fought with supernatural strength. And Roberts, sipping tea while cannon thundered, became a gentleman grim reaper in sailors' imaginations. The taverns of Nassau became the echo chambers of myth. Around mugs of rum, sailors told and retold these stories until truth and fiction blurred. But it did not matter. The empires could fight pirates with cannons and gallows, but they could not kill their legends. The names spread like wildfire, across oceans and continents, reaching even the poorest villages where people whispered, "There are men and women who defy kings, who take gold from the mighty, who live free if only for a while." And so the Golden Age of Piracy reached its fever pitch. Not just an era of theft and murder, but an age of theater, rebellion, and unforgettable characters who refused to be ordinary. Legends had risen from the waves, and the world would never see the sea the same way again. Life and law on the high seas. The legends may have been carved in smoke and cannon fire, but what gave piracy its strange endurance was not only daring captains or stolen gold, it was the life they built upon their decks. Beneath the skull and crossbones, banners, pirate ships were floating experiments in freedom, brutality, and survival. They were lawless to kings, but not to themselves. To understand piracy, one must step aboard a pirate vessel, not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet between storms when the sails hung slack, the men lounged on the deck, and the true rhythm of their lives revealed itself. The Pirate Code. Rules of Freedom. A pirate ship was no mob without order. Chaos meant death, and so, in smoky cabins lit by lanterns, crews drafted their own laws, the Articles, written by hand and signed, or marked with an X by the illiterate. These documents bound the men together. The codes varied, but certain principles echoed across seas. Loot was shared equally. The captain and quartermaster took extra shares, but every man received his due. A common sailor on a pirate ship might earn more in one raid than he would in a lifetime under a navy's lash. Injury was compensated. Lose a leg in battle, and you received gold in place of your labor. Lose an eye, and your share was guaranteed. It was a crude form of insurance, centuries ahead of its time. Disputes were settled by vote. If two men argued, the crew decided the matter, or they faced each other with pistols on the deck at dawn. Captains ruled only in battle. In peace, their word carried no more weight than any other man's. A captain who grew too cruel or cowardly could be stripped of command in an instant. It was, in its rough way, democracy at sea. For men who had suffered under merchant captains, who starved them, and naval officers who whipped them bloody, this system was liberation. On land, kings and lords ruled. At sea, the crew ruled themselves. Daily bread and bitter rum, but democracy did not ease the hardship of life at sea. Food was always scarce, often rancid. Sailors gnawed on salted pork so hard it had to be hammered apart. Biscuits swarmed with weevils, but the men joked the insects were extra meat. Water grew foul in barrels, slimy and green, until it was safer to drink rum. And rum they drank in great quantities to numb hunger, fear, and pain. The days stretched long. Men patched sails, swabbed decks, repaired ropes, and sharpened cutlasses. Some carved dice or whittled trinkets from wood. Others sang shanties to pass the hours, their voices carrying across the endless waves. At night, they huddled together, some telling tales of home they would never see again, others dreaming of gold they might never touch. Disease was a greater enemy than any navy. Scurvy rotted gums until teeth fell out, fevers carried men away in days, and wounds festered under the tropical sun. Surgeons were rare, and when present their tools were as terrifying as cannon fire, rusty saws, knives, and cauterizing irons. Many a man preferred death in battle to the surgeon's table. Justice among thieves. If the pirate code gave freedom, it also demanded obedience. Punishments were harsh, for a single betrayal could doom an entire crew. Theft of gold from a comrade's share could mean marooning, a slow death left alone on a barren island with nothing but a pistol and a bottle of water. Cowardice in battle brought the same fate. Mutiny was the greatest crime. A man who plotted against his captain without cause could find himself hanged from the yardarm by his own brothers. And yet, Mutiny was also the right of the crew, if their captain lost courage or mercy. This tension, this fragile balance, kept pirate ships both free and ruthless. There was a strange fairness in the cruelty. A naval officer might flog a man for the twitch of an eye. A pirate punished only betrayal, cowardice, or theft. To the common sailor, this was justice. Brotherhood beyond boundaries. Perhaps the most remarkable law of pirate life was not written in any article, but lived in practice, the brotherhood of the outcast. On a pirate ship, the boundaries of land dissolved. Black men, freed from chains, fought shoulder to shoulder with white men who had once been their masters. Natives from the islands, deserters from European armies, even escaped indentured servants, all found a place aboard the black-flagged ships. Historians record ships where a quarter or even half the crew were men of African descent, treated as equals, voting, sharing loot, and commanding respect. In an age when plantations turned human beings into cattle, pirate decks offered a strange, fleeting equality. It was imperfect, fragile, often tested, but it was real. And when a crew shouted, "A prize!" and the chase began, there were no races, no nations, only brothers bound by the hunt. The weight of the sea yet, for all their codes and freedoms, pirate life was haunted by the sea's cruelty. Storms rose without warning, towering waves snapping masts like twigs. Lightning split the sky, cannons clattered loose, and men were swept screaming into the black waters, never to surface again. Silence followed such storms. Survivors sat on drenched decks, staring at the horizon as if daring the sea to strike again. The bravest man could not defeat the ocean, only endure it. And endure they did, with laughter, with curses, with rum and song. But in their hearts, each man knew, the sea would claim them, if not today, then tomorrow. The balance of freedom and doom. So life went on, a strange balance of freedom and doom. The men lived fiercely because they lived briefly. Each feast. In Nassau's taverns, each cheer around a captured chest of silver was stolen from fate itself. Every night they slept, they knew the gallows might await them tomorrow. Yet in that brief, brutal life, they tasted something the empires could not provide. A voice, a vote, a share. They were not slaves to kings, but free men of the sea, and so, when asked why they chose piracy, many answered not with words, but with laughter. For how could one explain to those chained to land what it meant to live free, even if only for a season? Thus, the pirate ships became more than weapons of robbery. They were experiments in rebellion, laboratories of freedom, and crucibles of equality. They were both savage and noble, cruel and just. And while kings and governors named them criminals, the men themselves believed they had discovered a truth worth dying for, that life, no matter how short, was sweeter when lived under no man's thumb, blood and iron. The great naval hunts, the golden age of piracy, burned brightly, but no flame can rage forever. As pirate legends grew, so too did the fury of kings. To the empires, piracy had become more than a nuisance. It was an infection. Spanish galleons were looted. English merchants were ruined. French governors humiliated. In Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal, the black flag waved openly, daring the world to strike. And eventually, the world answered. The great hunts began not with a single order, but with a collective realization. Piracy threatened the very veins of empire. Without gold from the Americas, without the sugar and tobacco trade, without safe seas for merchants, crowns could not stand. And so fleets were dispatched, hangmen prepared their ropes, and governors sharpened their laws. The king's pardon. A trap in disguise at first. The empires tried honey before iron. In 1717, King George I of England issued a royal pardon to all pirates willing to surrender within a year. Any man who laid down his arms could return to society, free of punishment. Some accepted. Benjamin Hornigold, once a founding father of Nassau's Republic, bent the knee and hunted his former brothers as a privateer for the crown. Others, like Charles Vane, spat on the parchment and swore they would rather burn than beg. The pardon split crews, tore friendships, and sowed suspicion. In smoky taverns, pirates eyed each other with mistrust. Was their brother-in-arms secretly plotting to turn them in for gold? But even for those who accepted, peace was uneasy. Many who took the pardon soon returned to piracy when hunger gnawed again. Others discovered that the crown's mercy was hollow, traps laid to lure out the boldest captains. For every man who stepped off the black deck, another was strung up on the gallows. The fall of Nassau. The heart of piracy beat in Nassau, and the empires knew it had to be crushed. Woodes Rogers, a seasoned seaman turned royal governor, arrived in 1718 with soldiers, ships, and a mission: cleanse the island of pirates. He entered Nassau's harbor not with cannon fire, but with iron discipline. He offered the king's pardon, again promising mercy, yet behind his calm words was steel. Pirates who refused were hunted, dragged before courts, and hanged. The streets that had once echoed with laughter, rum songs, and pistol shots now trembled with the hammering of scaffolds. The pirate republic was over. Some fled to Tortuga, others deeper into the Spanish Main. A few, like Calico Jack and Anne Bonny, remained defiant. But Nassau's golden days were gone. Where once the black flag had flown proudly, the Union Jack now snapped in the wind. The naval hunts beyond Nassau, the seas became killing grounds. Warships, once too heavy and slow, learned to adapt. The British dispatched sleek sloops to chase the pirates in their own style, armed with ruthless captains who knew no mercy. Spain and France followed, unleashing their navies and forging temporary alliances against the common foe. Blackbeard himself fell to such a hunt. In 1718, Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy lured him into battle near Ocracoke Inlet. Blackbeard fought like a demon, pistols in both hands, cutlass dripping blood, his beard once again wreathed in smoke. Sailors swore he was shot 5 times, cut 20, and still he pressed forward. Only when his head was taken and hung from Maynard's bow did the battle end. Even in death, his legend grew. Bartholomew Roberts, too, met his fate at sea. In 1722, off the coast of West Africa, he faced HMS Swallow. Roberts, dressed in his finest crimson waistcoat, refused to flee. He stood at the rail as cannon fire tore through the air, struck by grape shot, his body falling lifeless. His crew, broken, was captured, and over 50 were executed in one mass hanging, the largest in pirate history. One by one, the great names fell. Vane hanged in Jamaica, Rackham too, his flamboyance gone to the rope. Anne Bonny and Mary Read escaped death only by pleading pregnancy, though Mary soon perished in prison. The noose tightened, the black flags fell, and the seas grew quieter. The gallows spectacle. The hunts did not end on the waves. They ended in public squares, where pirates were paraded in chains before jeering crowds. Governors made examples of them. Gallows rose in London, Port Royal, and Charleston, their beams black with tar, their ropes swinging with bodies. At execution. Dock in London, the condemned were marched through the streets, guarded by soldiers, their faces pale but unbowed. The hangman's knot was slipped over their necks, and the crowd leaned forward to hear last words. Some cursed the crown, spitting defiance even as the trapdoor fell. Others prayed, their voices breaking. A few, like Calico Jack, faced death with bitter regret. Their bodies, tarred and caged, were left to rot at harbor mouths, warnings to every sailor who dreamed of freedom. Here hangs a pirate, the wind seemed to whisper, and here ends your rebellion. Yet sailors whispered back, better to hang free than live a slave. The end of an age by the 1730s, the great naval hunts had done their work. The Caribbean, once alive with black flags, fell silent under the guns of empire. Treasure fleets sailed more securely, merchant captains slept easier, and governors congratulated themselves. But the price was more than ships and lives. Something wild, something untamed, had been extinguished. The pirate republic was gone. The legends hanged, but their ghosts lingered in taverns and tales. Sailors still sang of Blackbeard's smoke, of Anne Bonny's fury, of Robert's crimson waistcoat. And though the gallows had claimed their bodies, the empires could not claim their spirit. For the Golden Age had planted an idea too dangerous: to kill. That ordinary men and women could rise against crowns, create their own law, and live free, even if only for a fleeting season. Blood and iron. The great naval hunts, the Golden Age of Piracy, burned brightly, but no flame can rage forever. As pirate legends grew, so too did the fury of kings. To the empires, piracy had become more than a nuisance. It was an infection. Spanish galleons were looted, English merchants were ruined, French governors humiliated. In Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal, the black flag waved openly, daring the world to strike. And eventually, the world answered. The great hunts began not with a single order, but with a collective realization. Piracy threatened the very veins of empire. Without gold from the Americas, without the sugar and tobacco trade, without safe seas for merchants, crowns could not stand. And so fleets were dispatched, hangmen prepared their ropes, and governors sharpened their laws. The king's pardon. A trap in disguise. At first, the empires tried honey before iron. In 1717, King George I of England issued a royal pardon to all pirates willing to surrender within a year. Any man who laid down his arms could return to society free of punishment. Some accepted. Benjamin Hornigold, once a founding father of Nassau's republic, bent the knee and hunted his former brothers as a privateer for the crown. Others, like Charles Vane, spat on the parchment and swore they would rather burn than beg. The pardon split crews, tore friendships, and sowed suspicion. In smoky taverns, pirates eyed each other with mistrust. Was their brother-in-arms secretly plotting to turn them in for gold? But even for those who accepted, peace was uneasy. Many who took the pardon soon returned to piracy when hunger gnawed again. Others discovered that the crown's mercy was hollow, traps laid to lure out the boldest captains. For every man who stepped off the black deck, another was strung up on the gallows. The fall of Nassau, the heart of piracy, beat in Nassau, and the empires knew it had to be crushed. Woodes Rogers, a seasoned seaman turned royal governor, arrived in 1718 with soldiers, ships, and a mission: cleanse the island of pirates. He entered Nassau's harbor not with cannon fire, but with iron discipline. He offered the king's pardon, again promising mercy, yet behind his calm words was steel. Pirates who refused were hunted, dragged before courts, and hanged. The streets that had once echoed with laughter, rum songs, and pistol shots now trembled with the hammering of scaffolds. The pirate republic was over. Some fled to Tortuga, others deeper into the Spanish Main. A few, like Calico Jack and Anne Bonny, remained defiant. But Nassau's golden days were gone. Where once the black flag had flown proudly, the Union Jack now snapped in the wind. The naval hunts beyond Nassau, the seas became killing grounds. Warships, once too heavy and slow, learned to adapt. The British dispatched sleek sloops to chase the pirates in their own style, armed with ruthless captains who knew no mercy. Spain and France followed, unleashing their navies and forging temporary alliances against the common foe. Blackbeard himself fell to such a hunt. In 1718, Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy lured him into battle near Ocracoke Inlet. Blackbeard fought like a demon, pistols in both hands, cutlass dripping blood, his beard once again wreathed in smoke. Sailors swore he was shot 5. Times, cut 20, and still he pressed forward. Only when his head was taken and hung from Maynard's bow did the battle end. Even in death, his legend grew. Bartholomew Roberts, too, met his fate at sea. In 1722, off the coast of West Africa, he faced HMS Swallow. Roberts, dressed in his finest crimson waistcoat, refused to flee. He stood at the rail as cannon fire tore through the air, struck by grape shot, his body falling lifeless. His crew, broken, was captured, and over 50 were executed in one mass hanging, the largest in pirate history. One by one, the great names fell. Vane hanged in Jamaica. Rackham, too, his flamboyance gone to the rope. Anne Bonny and Mary Red escaped death only by pleading pregnancy, though Mary soon perished in prison. The noose tightened, the black flags fell, and the seas grew, quieter. The gallows spectacle. The hunts did not end on the waves. They ended in public squares, where pirates were paraded in chains before jeering crowds. Governors made examples of them. Gallows rose in London, Port Royal, and Charleston, their beams black with tar, their ropes swinging with bodies, at execution. Dock in London, the condemned were marched through the streets, guarded by soldiers, their faces pale but unbowed. The hangman's knot was slipped over their necks, and the crowd leaned forward to hear last words. Some cursed the crown, spitting defiance even as the trapdoor fell. Others prayed, their voices breaking. A few, like Calico Jack Rackham, faced death with bitter regret. Their bodies, tarred and caged, were left to rot at harbor mouths, warnings to every sailor who dreamed of freedom. Here hangs a pirate, the wind seemed to whisper, and here ends your rebellion. Yet sailors whispered back, better to hang free than live a slave. The end of an age, by the 1730s, the great naval hunts had done their work. The Caribbean, once alive with black flags, fell silent under the guns of empire. Treasure fleets sailed more securely, merchant captains slept easier, and governors congratulated themselves. But the price was more than ships and lives. Something wild, something untamed, had been extinguished. The pirate republic was gone. The legends hanged, but their ghosts lingered in taverns and tales. Sailors still sang of Blackbeard's smoke, of Anne Bonny's fury, of Roberts's crimson waistcoat. And though the gallows had claimed their bodies, the empires could not claim their spirit. For the Golden Age had planted an idea too dangerous: to kill, that ordinary men and women could rise against crowns, create their own law, and live free, even if only for a fleeting season. The shadows of decline. The Golden Age of Piracy had always burned like a torch held too close to dry tinder, bright, furious, and destined to consume itself. By the 1730s, the torch had dimmed, leaving only embers glowing faintly across the seas. The black flags that once struck terror in merchants and monarchs alike were fewer, their once proud symbols tattered, their crews hunted like animals. Where once pirates swaggered through Nassau's streets or drank in Port Royal's taverns, now gallows and prisons loomed. The brotherhood of the coast was shattered, a sea gone silent. There was a time when the horizon itself seemed dangerous, when every sail spotted at dawn might be a pirate sloop cutting for the wind. But as the hunts spread and the pardons expired, the seas began to fall quiet. Merchant captains once trembled when shadows appeared on the waves. Now they sailed with more confidence, guarded by naval escorts and stronger convoy systems, the day. Pirate havens were no longer sanctuaries. Nassau, once the pirate republic, was now a crown colony patrolled by soldiers. Tortuga had been abandoned to history, its fires long extinguished. Even Port Royal, punished by earthquakes and storms, had lost its wicked luster. The Caribbean, once the heart of defiance, was now a cage of empire. Pirates still roamed, but their numbers dwindled. A few stubborn captains refused to bend, men like Edward Lowe, whose cruelty horrified even his peers, or the remnants of small crews hiding in the Gulf of Mexico. Yet these were no longer legends. but scavengers, their sails ragged, their ships leaking, their loot little more than scraps compared to the golden days of Blackbeard or Roberts. The ghosts of gallows. The greatest symbol of decline was not the silence of the seas, but the noise of the gallows. In London, Charleston, Kingston, and Havana, executions became spectacles. Crowds gathered by the thousands, jeering, cheering, or watching in grim silence as pirates were marched in chains. Some went cursing, some went praying, a few laughed, spitting at the soldiers who tied the ropes. But all ended the same way, swinging in the wind as examples to the world. Their tarred bodies were hung in cages at harbor mouths, seagulls pecking at their remains while ships passed beneath. Sailors whispered as they sailed by, crossing themselves or muttering oaths as if to ask forgiveness from the ghosts of men who had once been free. For the families left behind, the gallows were crueler than any storm. Wives were left widowed, children fatherless, and mothers received no bodies to bury, only the bitter knowledge that their sons' bones hung as trophies of empire. Fractured brotherhood. The greatest strength of pirates had been their brotherhood, the code that bound them across race, nation, and creed. But in decline, that brotherhood fractured. Hunger made men betray their comrades for a chance at pardon. Some captains turned informants, leading naval hunters straight to hidden coves in exchange for their lives. Others fought each other over, dwindling prizes, pirate against pirate, in desperate battles that stained the seas with blood. The unity that once made them a force to challenge nations dissolved into suspicion and despair. Trust was a rare coin, and betrayal its common counterfeit. The age of brotherhood had ended, leaving only scattered outlaws clinging to the memory of freedom. The weight of time itself was a relentless enemy. The seas aged men quickly. Salt, hunger, disease, and wounds carved them into ghosts long before death claimed them. Survivors of the early days, those who had once feasted in Nassau or fought alongside legends, now sat in taverns as beggars, their bodies broken, their stories dismissed as drunken ramblings. Some found themselves pressed back into merchant service, flogged once more under the lash of masters they had defied. Others hid in fishing villages, their black flags buried in the sand, their swords rusting in silence. A few managed to vanish into anonymity, living quietly under false names, their pasts whispered only to trusted ears in dark corners. But for most, there was no escape. The last sparks, and yet, even in decline, sparks of defiance flickered. A lone ship would sometimes strike, seizing a prize and disappearing into the mist. Rumors spread of treasure hidden on remote islands, of survivors of Blackbeard's crew still haunting the Carolinas, of Anne Bonny living in secrecy, her dagger never far from reach. These were not the grand, sweeping legends of old, but whispers, fading embers glowing in the ashes of the great fire. The world wanted piracy buried, but the sea has a long memory, and the black flag never fully sank. The end of the Golden Age. By the mid-18th century, piracy was no longer a tide, but a trickle. The great names were dead, the havens closed, the seas patrolled. The Golden Age had ended, not with a single battle, but with exhaustion, with iron discipline, with the crushing weight of empire. Yet the decline was not truly an end. The stories remained. Sailors still told them in hushed tones, merchants still feared them in secret, and children still dreamed of freedom upon the waves. The pirates themselves had been hunted into shadows, but their spirit lingered like salt in the air. And in that lingering spirit was something dangerous, an idea that no gallows could hang, no fleet could capture, that for a brief, glorious moment, ordinary men and women had stood against the greatest empires of earth, and for a time they had won.